Michel de Montaigne's Scepticism, by John Vespasian. I view Michel de Montaigne, 1533 to 1592, as the first thinker who realized that skepticism can save one's life. His insight is still true today and will remain true for as long as people keep using deceit and misrepresentation to further their interests. Unfortunately, Montaigne's defense of skepticism is rather messy. In some essays, he rightly refuses to believe other people's statements when they contradict his own experience. I would call that prudence rather than skepticism, and I consider it a perfectly valid attitude. However, in some other essays, Montaigne doubts his own perceptions because they might be wrong. Since he also doubts other people's perceptions, what is the result? His universal doubts lead him to skepticism and intellectual paralysis. Montaigne's essay titled, "That it is folly to measure truth, an error by our own capacity," shows precisely this deficiency. It raises questions on the validity of one's perceptions, logic, and conclusions, and speaks in favor of universal skepticism. I categorize Montaigne's arguments as messy because they are shooting in all directions. Instead of questioning ideas that are unproven, Montaigne goes overboard and starts to question all ideas, all perceptions, and all conclusions. Reasons for Montaigne's skepticism. Why was Montaigne reluctant to trust his own perceptions and his own logic? Because of egoism, he explains. He was afraid that his own self-interest would distort his perception of the facts and lead him to wrong conclusions. I consider Montaigne's argument extremely weak because one can easily correct emotional distortions. The only thing we need to do is to compare our conclusions with reality. Do they hold water, or do they contradict the facts? Even worse, Montaigne found skepticism great because he regarded it as a form of humility. Why am I to make definite statements about anything, he thought. How can I be totally certain of anything if there are people wiser than me? Montaigne's humility comes from his Catholic background and pollutes his whole philosophy. Humility makes him doubt his own shadow because, who knows, the sun might go away tomorrow. Let the earth go dark and efface all shadows. It is folly to measure truth, an error by our own capacity. To prove the point that it is folly to measure truth, an error by our own capacity, Montaigne uses far-fetched illustrations drawn from ancient history and literature. For instance, he mentions the myth of Atlantis drawn from the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, authored by Plato, 427 to 347 BC. According to Plato, an advanced civilization named Atlantis had existed centuries earlier on a large island located beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. Montaigne summarizes Plato's description of Atlantis and then questions its veracity. Fair enough. I think that Montaigne was right to distrust Plato. In fact, I would argue that most of what Plato wrote on any subject should be regarded as fiction. The problem with Montaigne is that, after raising questions about Plato's veracity, he overshoots and overkills. In good logic, he should have concluded that one should distrust wild stories even if they are told by famous people. Instead, he employed bad logic and concluded that one should distrust all stories from all people all the time. I have called Montaigne's defense of skepticism messy and inconsistent because, in his arguments, he is trying to prove A and the opposite of A. His reference to Plato's Atlantis speaks against trusting anything we hear, but then he speaks in favor of trusting the ancient Roman records about Hannibal's wars. Really? How much would you trust what Titus Livius, 59 BC, 17 AD, wrote about Hannibal, 247 to 182 BC? Since Livy wrote his history of Rome 2 centuries after Hannibal's death, his descriptions must have been approximate at best. By mentioning Livy's history of Rome, Montaigne is not bringing any solid argument to the table. Whether Livy gives an accurate or inaccurate description of Hannibal's crossing of the Alps does not speak against or in favor of skepticism. The key lesson from Montaigne's skepticism. Montaigne's best argument concerns the ancient philosopher Pythagoras, 6th century BC, who had apparently figured out that the earth revolves around the sun and not the other way round. Few people had believed Pythagoras in that respect, even if he was right. Thus, Montaigne rightly concluded that we should think twice before endorsing the majority's opinion. It happens that, sometimes, minorities are right. One should be skeptical of social pressure and monolithic beliefs. People in Europe had also doubted Herodotus for 185 to 425 BC, when he had recounted the yearly flooding of the Nile River in Egypt. However, their majority opinion had proven wrong. The truth is the truth, whether people believe it or not. The key lesson to be learned from Montaigne is that critical thinking, skepticism about unproven claims, can save one's life when things get tough. Skepticism goes hand in hand with nonlinear thinking. We tend to predict the future by what we see today, observes Montaigne, but linear thinking can lead to false assumptions. It is up to each of us to scrutinize our assumptions as carefully as we scrutinize the facts. In particular, Montaigne calls for considering opinions that contradict our beliefs. Even if it feels uncomfortable to put our cherished beliefs to the test, it pays off to do so. Let us remain skeptical about immovable truths and self-evident doctrines. If you are interested in putting rational ideas into practice in all sorts of situations, I recommend my book, Undisrupted: How Highly Effective People Deal with Disruptions. For more information, go to johnvespasian.com.